At this year's Munich Security Conference, the question wasn't just how the world is changing, it was whether the West is still aligned enough to respond. Beneath the speeches, a quieter unease emerged. Tensions within the transatlantic relationship are starting to ripple outward. The war in Ukraine remains stalled, China is gaining ground, and in Iran, protesters continue to face repression. All of this is unfolding, but at Munich, the U.S. and Europe were very much focused inwards on their own relationship, debating their roles, responsibilities, and priorities. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reaffirmed America's commitment to Europe.
The United States and Europe, we belong together. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, our cherished allies, and our oldest friends.
So the question becomes, how is this moment actually reshaping international security? And as the West works through its differences, who's stepping in to fill the gaps? To help us make sense of this, I am joined by Dr. Jana Puglierin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and head of its Berlin office, and Giles Whittell, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at The Observer. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. It's been an extraordinary several weeks. Frankly, it's been an extraordinary year for transatlantic relations, for international order. Many of us have been looking at Munich, been in Munich. Some of us were in Davos. Jana, let me start with you, since you're in Germany, and I am sure just recovering from Munich. Maybe we could start by just getting your sort of overall impressions of the conference, of the vibe. Did you come out of it with a very different sense of Europe's position with respect to the United States, of the transatlantic relationship, or did you sort of go in expecting one thing and come out with those expectations unchanged?
So I think the state of the transatlantic relationship was the theme during the Munich Security Conference. Everything else was secondary, including Ukraine, Russia, China. So it was really about how we feel about each other and what unites us still, or what drives us apart. And as you know, because you've been there as well, Leslie, but there were several reactions to the Rubio speech, ranging from, oh, this was really reassuring and basically this is the end of the bullying, to, well, this was pretty much the same speech, just now wrapped into a nice present or a nice kind of offer, basically. For me, I think the speeches are completely alike. I noticed the different tone. I noticed the effort to reach out to Europeans to reassure them that the US is not going anywhere and that there is a continued interest in the transatlantic relationship. But I'm still digesting the, I think, 15 times that Secretary of State mentioned Western civilization. And this, to me, was the essence of the speech. So there was this offer to Europe. We can do great things together, but only if we agree on the principles, and the principles are basically make Western civilization great again. And I'm not sure if I think that is such an attractive offer to Europe.
But I want to ask you one specific question, which is, for those who were actually in the room, there was a standing ovation. And this is extraordinary, really. I'm curious, what do you make of that standing ovation that was given to Secretary Rubio right after his speech?
After a lot of criticism, now German politicians who stood up after the speech and applauded are now saying that was an act of politeness, but I think that is not entirely true. I mean, of course, it was kind of to show respect to kind of a very prestigious guest. Having the Secretary of State in Munich was something that Wolfgang Ischinger, the chair of the Munich Security Conference, was very proud of. And when he moderated a discussion with Rubio, basically said, there was a huge sigh of relief in these halls. And I think that's because Europe is still trying to digest I think there was a lot of anxiety in the room before the speech. People were kind of thinking about what will he say? What is basically the next thing that is coming to haunt us? And then at first sight, nothing kind of quite that damaging happened to the transatlantic relationship. And I think many in that very moment did not realize what Secretary Rubio actually just said. But in the overflow room where I was, the people were much less thrilled. I had a great colleague of ours, another think tanker working on Russia, turning around telling me that he was very much reminded of Vladimir Putin, so make the past great again. So that was more the atmosphere in the room I was in. But when it comes to this speech, I think it's the most discussed item at the Munich Security Conference, and even afterwards.
You know, I just spent 20 years in the UK, and I can tell you that you almost never get a standing ovation in the United Kingdom. I mean, you know, I would for years be the only person standing at the end of a West End performance, hoping that somebody would join me. I mean, it's just not done, except for in very exceptional cases. And I assume Germany is not far off that mark. So it's really something. And I was also in the overflow room and would confirm the disconnect that you felt. Giles, you've been editing for one of the UK's leading and one of the world's leading papers, you know, watching it and presumably editing a lot of people's writing on it. What was your kind of main takeaway from the Munich Security Conference?
Well, first, I'd just like to come back on the ovation. I wasn't there, as I mentioned. We had a reporter in the room, but I'm not at all surprised by the standing ovation. The tone was so markedly different. The syntax was conventional. It was at least a recognizable political speech, whereas Trump's 70 minutes in Davos, I was in the room for that speech, were, to put it politely, unhinged. The sole point of sanity there was his rollback on Greenland. But for about 1,200 people in that room, this was a rare exposure to what he calls the weave, referring to the teleprompter perhaps once every 5 minutes, and then going off on an unconnected and frankly embarrassing and then eventually boring set of tangents. So just because you had a senior politician looking and sounding conventional, I'm not surprised by the fact that he had a standing ovation. However, as an editor, handling copy on Saturday afternoon, 2 points. One is our correspondent completely agreed with Jana and many others on the idea that this was a different tone, but a very similar message. I scribbled down, not unhinged, but unapologetic. That line, which in Germany must have really cut through, don't be shackled by shame, I paraphrase slightly. This was a dog whistle to the AfD, if ever there was one. And then a prominent message to Europe, exactly similar to last year, to step up, which leads to my second point, more one as the dust has settled, which is taking a step back, looking at the conference and the moment as a whole. And I reached the conclusion that Europe is acutely aware of the requirement to step up, but hasn't got there yet. And I thought, finally, one thing that was really striking was the big idea on European defense didn't come from Europe. It came from Elbridge Colby a little before, saying, guys, we are still here for you, for the nuclear umbrella, for intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, all those things that the US is so good at. But step up within NATO, let's call it NATO 3.0, the framework for European security going forward. That came from the US, but I don't see the big strategic thinking, bringing all strands of thought together that Europe needs yet.
Jana, I want to come to you on this. You know, I mean, the AfD was there because of Vance's speech. The Americans are pushing the envelope on, you know, what Europe needs to do. I mean, I sat in on many conversations that I thought were, you know, brilliantly self-reflective on the part of Europeans, concrete in terms of proposals for reform, opening up the market more. That certainly didn't exist on the U.S. side. But Jana, what was your take on sort of Europe within this?
The AfD, that's interesting because the AfD has been present at the Munich Security Conference before. The former chair of the conference, Christoph Heusgen, had decided to not invite them any longer. Not the AfD, and also not another party called the BSW, which is also kind of more of a left-wing fringe party, also very populist. And so they are basically going back to where they've been before, but it was kind of a heated discussion and got a lot of different opinions in Germany and the kind of political bubble.
Can I ask you, how many years were they out, crowded out?
I think from 2022 till 2025. I think Heusgen did it for 3 years, but they were invited before. And what I think is interesting, and I wanted to make this point, is that Rubio had to say on substance was dividing not only the Europeans, but also the Americans. And I think that is generally something that we need to take note of. So this whole question of who are we? What is the West? What kind of civilizational values do we have? And how do we want to go forward? I think it divides audiences in Europe and the United States alike. We're basically arguing with each other about our values, about what the United States stands for. That was very visible because there were also many Democrats there at the Munich Security Conference, and not that many, I think, supporters of Rubio's approach, with the exception of the AfD and some Hungarian and Slovakian participants. And while Keir Starmer was speaking, he was speaking on a panel with Ursula von der Leyen, which I thought was a nice setup because it was all about how the UK and the EU are moving closer together again. But in December, we failed to bring the UK closer to the EU defense initiatives. And so there is no possibility for the UK to join SAFE, or there was no agreement on this. So what stayed with me was this disconnect between the big strategic speeches on the kind of level of the heads of state and government, and then the events on the ground, or the kind of problems with kind of a too technocratic approach. So I think the Europeans have learned the lesson. They understand that the transatlantic relationship has changed and will most likely never go back to what it once has been.
Giles, when you look at this, maybe, from the UK perspective, China, India, both there, both present, but it was sort of, where they were central, but was anybody paying attention? On the way to Munich, I spent 3 days in meetings across London, and God, talk about a dramatic time in UK politics. Starmer seems to have, come through for now. There he is at Munich, sitting alongside von der Leyen. How did you read where the UK fits in all of this right now, both with respect to Europe, the United States? How would you capture the current moment?
I think if I knew the answer to your question, I'd have a very senior job in government, or maybe in NATO. The whole point about the UK and its place in the world is we're still trying to figure that out 10 years after we voted to leave the EU. I was listening back to one of your previous conversations and to the idea that the special relationship, so-called, has always been a third rail of UK politics. And I was thinking, well, that's definitely the case during the Conservative administrations that over the past 100 years had taken up about 3/4 of all British political time when Tony Blair has not been in charge. There is a strong strain of skepticism on the left about that special relationship. And of course, within Keir Starmer's party, a lot of people voted to stay in the EU, including Starmer himself. And the two big questions in UK politics at the moment are whether Keir Starmer survives in office, because he's had a very inauspicious first year and a half, and whether whoever remains Prime Minister until 2029 actually achieves a closer relationship with Europe, which will probably involve biting the bullet on free movement to get closer to the single market. I'm really struck by the way a year ago, defense was seen by Starmer and his team as a means to an end. Defense and security, that whole conversation, as a means to an end, the end being that closer relationship with the EU. Now, as the US pulls back from the security relationship, the war grinds on in Ukraine. The threat, I think, of the Russian geostrategic threat remains. I don't think everything that you hear about the possibility of further brinkmanship elsewhere up the Eastern Front in the Baltics, you've got to take that seriously. And so now, from the UK and the European perspective, that security relationship between the EU and the UK is not just a means to an end. It is a strategic challenge that has to be met and isn't so far. It was thought at the beginning of last year that SAFE project would be a
no-brainer.
A no-brainer, exactly. and we fell at the first hurdle. I don't know whether that was because of Macron's insistence that French military contractors have the first bite of the cherry, but it just shows how very complex any of these avenues for rapprochement are now that we're out of the EU.
I think I've just seen that Canada is joining SAFE, correct?
Yes, Canada is the only third country, and Ukraine has special access to the EU new defense programs, but Canada is the only other country.
So, I mean, this sort of goes, I guess, to, another topic that I'd like us to be sure to consider. There's supposed to be, this sort of Europe returning to looking outward. The EU-India deal has just been agreed, but Zelensky speaks. It runs over, unusually for Munich, and then everybody exits the main room just as the German foreign minister and the Indian foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, take the stage. So days after the EU-India deal is signed, this is supposed to be, a really major partnership to help in this broader ambition of diversification of partnerships in the face of a disruptive United States. And the room's kind of empty. So, Jana, you had started by saying, the whole conference was really about us, meaning Europe, and the transatlantic relationship. Maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah, if I compare it with previous Munich Security Conferences, I vividly recall the one in 2020, where it was basically all about China and the Indo-Pacific. China was the big challenge back then. There was this hope also that one could work together, basically, to work on a joint US, EU, China strategy. So it was really not front and center. I mean, as you said, there were all the side events or kind of the presence on the big stages, but I bumped into a colleague yesterday who told me that she attended a side event on Japan with 6 people in the room. So I really think, yes.
Right after a historic election, too.
So I really think it was really very much going back to the roots of the Munich Security Conference. It started with a focus only on Europe and the US and the transatlantic relationship. And then in recent years, the focus has broadened a lot. But this year, I think every topic that was not us had a very tough time. I think Ukraine was mentioned in all of the speeches, except Secretary Rubio mentioned it in passing. But even here, I think the attention was not what it used to in the past 3 years. But China, I want to share one moment with you because I thought this was so interesting, because I listened to the Rubio speech and I stayed seated for Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. And Rubio was all about the United Nations have not produced any tangible kind of action plan to solve one of the big problems in the world. And we concentrate on us and the Western civilization and go back to our glorious past. And then Wang Yi entered the scene, basically starting with make the United Nations great again. They are a fantastic organization. Small and medium-sized countries deserve more representation. He talked a lot about global governance, using the very term global governance. And if I had not known that China was supporting Russia's war of aggression and was basically coercing all sorts of countries with a kind of economic pressure, I would have thought this is the nicest country in the world. And it was just, the contrast was so stark.
Giles, I want to hear from you on this. We've watched in recent weeks leader after leader, including Keir Starmer, travel to China. Mark Carney going to China, others going to China. How did you kind of capture this moment? Where in the world is Europe on China, and what has the Davos to Munich moment told us about that?
I think every European member state and the UK is, to a greater or lesser extent, still economically dependent on China. There's no growth. I think the economic arguments behind those trips that Starmer and others have been making are the most obvious ones. You can't unravel the sort of economic mutual dependency created over the course of 3 decades so quickly, nor does the UK government, for one, want to do that. But I am really preoccupied by a question for both of you guys, because you were there, which is to what extent Trump's actions in Venezuela and Greenland were seen in Munich as an invitation to China to do what it wants in Taiwan. That seems to me to be the geopolitical challenge which is heading towards us all, which, if it goes badly wrong, will make Ukraine seem like a tea party. Did China manage to put everyone's minds at rest on that, or was it just not discussed?
I hate to say it, but the most attention that Taiwan seems to have gotten at the Munich Security Conference is a critique of AOC for not being able to answer the question on where America stands on Taiwan, whether it would put boots in the ground. That's kind of captured a lot of headline. But I don't know, Jana, I've always personally been skeptical that the Chinese, read their capabilities and abilities and their opportunity with respect to Taiwan off of, what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine or elsewhere. I think they consider it a separate strategic situation, as I think do the Americans. But I'm not sure, Jana, how you would see the answer to that question.
So discussions in Germany, the idea that there could be some coordinated actions between Putin and Xi and Ukraine and Taiwan is one that you hear quite often recently. I think from a European perspective, what we fear most is that there is basically an incident in the Indo-Pacific and the US's attention is torn towards the Indo-Pacific. Everybody is engaged there, and this basically creates a window of opportunity for Vladimir Putin, because we know that he's always looking for opportunities to exploit. Although I think it is maybe not likely that, Xi makes his decision dependent on Putin or vice versa. There could be some fallout or, after one of the two has taken a decision that could raise the stakes, and that is what we worry. You've seen that at the Munich Security Conference, that Europe cannot defend itself for the foreseeable future without the United States. So I think that is also something that led to the standing ovations and overall kind of the many speeches where Europeans tried to explain that they still believe in the transatlantic relationship, that they understood that they need to step up, but that they don't want to fill in a divorce right now. And that is because we are so aware how crucial it is to have American troop presence in Europe and also to have access to the crucial capabilities like strategic enablers, because without many of the American capabilities, we would be completely unable to defend Europe.
As we come to a close, I want to ask one final question of each of you, and it's about the United States. I was struck at the Munich Security Conference and in general that within Europe, there seems to be one narrative, which is, the U.S. has changed. We kind of need to keep it in for the reasons that Jana's just described. And what do we do? At Munich, we saw, AOC was there, Governor Newsom was there, Gretchen Whitmer was there. A lot of people were there. But is there, a more rigorous, nuanced conversation in the UK, in Europe, beyond the headline of, America's not been coming back? Like, is there thinking going on? And because this could turn out in many different directions. It seems to be this deep reflection in Europe on Europe, not such deep reflection in Europe on the United States. Giles, let me start with you on this.
I would contest that. We're completely obsessed with the US, and we talk about it all the time. Some of it is knee-jerk. Some of it is quite nuanced. I think Bill Clinton said in 1992, I still believe in a place called hope. Well, in 2026, I still believe in a place called America. You mentioned Newsom. I spoke with him briefly in Davos. He is guns blazing, using Trump tactics against Trump, wants to be contender in 2028. The midterms could go down to the wire, but the entire political situation could be overturned there. I think, just final point, it's a cliche, but it's true that trust lost is hard to regain. And so there are a lot of people in Europe who recognize how the system works in the States, that we could very well have 8 years of democratic government, or at least sane governance after this. But just as when Europe looks at Brexit Britain, in principle, might welcome the idea of rejoining. But then what happens if you have a Reform UK-style government wanting to unscramble the whole thing all over again? So the question is, with the transatlantic relationship, Europe looking across at the US, fully aware that the whole MAGA fever dream may pass, but it might come back again.
Fascinating. And Jana, your thinking on this?
Yeah, I think Germany's obsessed as well. But sometimes I think the perception is not as nuanced as it should be, because It's very much dominated by the Trump administration and what Trump does, and the notion that there is a different America, or that kind of America is a very polarized and divided country, and that kind of President Trump has not won the US election by a landslide, although he always claims otherwise. So still, the perception of the United States has been deteriorating. And we had done a big poll just recently in November, and here you could really see that for the majority in many European countries, the US is no longer a trusted ally, but more a necessary partner you need to work with. I think that the trust is not lost forever, but still, I think there is also a broader sentiment here, and I think it's a healthy and good one, that there can be a more European-friendly government in the US, but it will not go back to where it once was when it comes to burden sharing. I think this is now really about burden shifting, and I don't see an incoming Democratic president redeploying a lot of troops to Europe once they are withdrawn. And I think this understanding that the US doesn't want to feel as responsible as it used to for Europe, for European affairs, is something that is bipartisan in a way. And I think it's good for Europe not to think that the Trump years are always an aberration, and afterwards we have a US president basically telling us the US is back and we can go back to our back chairs, but to have a notion that the task for Europe to step up and to take its own destiny in its hands is here to stay. I think that is a healthy development.
Yes, and that was certainly one of the overarching themes, if not the theme, of the Munich Security Conference. This has been a fascinating conversation. Giles, Whittell, Jana Puglierin, I really sincerely appreciate your thoughts, and I encourage our listeners to read your readings and The Observer, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.